People say the day you bury your husband is the worst day of your life. They say grief blinds you, the tears choke your breath, and the world suddenly turns gray and unfamiliar, like a house where someone quietly rearranged all the furniture while you were asleep. That's what people say. And that's exactly what everyone believed was happening to me that morning as I stood beside the polished walnut casket at St. Andrew's Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I wore a black dress I had bought years earlier for another funeral. My hands were folded calmly in front of me. My eyes were dry. The lace veil cast a faint shadow across my face, and from the outside I must have looked exactly the way people expected a 72-year-old widow to look, frozen in quiet shock. Behind me, whispers drifted through the church like low buzzing. "Poor Margaret," murmured Mrs. Callahan, our neighbor from 2 houses down. "Look at her. She hasn't cried once. She must be in shock." Another woman answered softly. They were such a devoted couple, 45 years together. That kind of love barely exists anymore. A third voice joined them, one I recognized as the wife of my husband's business partner. David was a good man, honest, hard-working. Everything he did was for his family. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, just to keep from turning around and laughing, because the man lying inside that casket was not the man they were describing. They were mourning David Carter, the respected businessman, the generous church donor, the reliable man who shook hands firmly and spoke with calm authority at community meetings. But I wasn't burying that man. I was burying a stranger. Or worse, I was burying an enemy I had shared a bed with for 45 years. No one in that church knew what I knew. No one knew why my small black handbag suddenly felt heavy in my hand. It wasn't the tissues inside it, and it wasn't the old rosary my mother had given me decades earlier. It was the phone resting at the bottom of the bag, a phone that didn't belong to me, and that until 48 hours earlier I didn't even know existed. Even now, as the priest spoke about devotion and loyalty, I could feel that phone like a piece of burning coal pressing against my hip through the fabric of the purse. To understand why my revenge that day was silence, I have to tell the story from the beginning, not from the funeral, but from the lie. My name is Margaret Carter. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of how I died and came back to life in the same week. I met David in 1978 when we were both in our 20s, and Charleston was still the kind of place where everyone recognized each other at the grocery store. He worked in sales for a construction company, and I was a receptionist at a small law office downtown, quietly dreaming about going back to college to study literature one day. David had the kind of confidence that filled a room before he even spoke. He laughed easily, shook hands like he already owned the future, and made people feel as if they were lucky just to stand near him. On our third date, we were sitting at a seafood restaurant near the harbor when he leaned across the table and said something that, at the time, sounded romantic enough to make my heart race. "Margaret," he said softly, "you're not meant to struggle through life. Let me deal with the hard world out there. You take care of making our home beautiful." I believed him completely. When he proposed 6 months later, I said yes without hesitation, because I truly thought I had won the lottery of life. The first years of our marriage felt exactly the way I imagined happiness should feel. We bought a small white house on Maple Street. I filled the kitchen with the smell of cornbread and roast chicken, and he came home every evening talking about deals, clients, and opportunities. Then slowly, so slowly I barely noticed at first, things began to change. The first thing to disappear was my job. One evening, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, David looked up from his plate and said casually, "You don't need to work anymore. My salary is enough, and besides, I don't like the idea of coming home to an empty house. I hesitated for a moment, but he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Trust me," he said with a smile. "This is better for both of us." So I quit. The second thing he took control of was money. One afternoon, while reviewing our bank papers, he laughed softly and said, "You hate dealing with numbers. Let me manage the finances so you don't have to worry about any of it." From that day forward, David controlled every account, every bill, and every dollar. He gave me a small weekly allowance for groceries and household expenses. At first, it seemed reasonable, but as the years passed and prices rose, that money became harder and harder to stretch. For 45 years, I lived performing quiet miracles with small bills. I remember standing in grocery store aisles comparing detergent prices, buying store brands and counting coins to see if I could afford good steak for David, while I quietly ate soup or leftovers. "The economy's rough right now," he would sigh in the evenings while pretending to study paperwork. "Business hasn't been easy lately." I believed him because he looked tired, because he came home late, and because he wore the same suits year after year. "I'm doing this for us," he would say, "so you never have to worry." And I felt guilty for even thinking about money. I felt like a burden. Poor David, I would think, working himself to exhaustion while I stayed home. So I tried to compensate. Our house was spotless. His shirts were ironed so sharply the sleeves could slice paper. His favorite meals were always waiting on the table. If he said he was thirsty, I had a glass of water in my hand before he finished the sentence. I stopped seeing my friends because he said they were bad influences who filled my head with nonsense. I stopped painting because he complained the smell of oil paint gave him headaches. Little by little, without realizing it, I erased myself completely. I wasn't Margaret anymore. I was simply David Carter's wife. And that's how the decades passed. Our 2 children grew up and eventually moved away, relieved, though I didn't understand it at the time, to escape their father's rigid rules and quiet authority. But I stayed because I believed loyalty meant endurance, because I believed marriage meant sacrifice, and because I believed the man I married loved me, until 3 days before his funeral. That Tuesday morning started like any other morning in our house. David complained that his coffee was too hot, adjusted his navy tie in the hallway mirror, picked up his briefcase and kissed my forehead. "I'll be late tonight," he said casually. "Dinner with investors from Atlanta. Don't wait up." The kiss was quick and routine, like sealing an envelope. Then he walked out the door. At 3:14 that afternoon, the phone rang, and with that single call, everything I believed about my life shattered forever. At 3:14 that afternoon, the phone rang while I was rinsing dishes in the kitchen sink. The house was quiet the way it always was during the day, the kind of quiet that hums softly around you after decades of routine. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered the landline without thinking. "Mrs. Carter?" a calm voice asked. "This is Memorial Medical Center. Your husband, David Carter, suffered a massive heart attack on King Street about an hour ago. I'm very sorry. We did everything we could." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. I remember staring at the refrigerator magnet shaped like a lighthouse while the woman kept talking. My mind tried to arrange the sentence into something harmless, something temporary, something that could still be fixed. But the final word landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Deceased. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I remember screaming so loudly the cat ran under the couch. The taxi ride to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and tears. I kept repeating the same sentence over and over in my head. This morning he complained about the coffee. This morning he tied his navy tie. This morning he walked out the door alive. When I arrived, a nurse led me into a small cold room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper. A doctor spoke to me gently about cardiac arrest, about how quickly it had happened, about how sometimes there is nothing anyone can do. I nodded like someone watching a movie about another woman's life. Then the nurse handed me a clear plastic bag. These were the personal items he had with him, she said softly. Inside the bag were the things I recognized immediately. David's brown leather wallet, worn at the edges, his watch, the keys to our house. But there was something else, a phone, a sleek black smartphone inside a leather case. I stared at it, confused. David hated smartphones. He had always carried an old gray flip phone and used it only for calls. "Internet is a distraction," he used to say. "I don't need all that nonsense." I looked up at the nurse. "Are you sure this is his?" I asked. She nodded. It was in the inside pocket of his jacket. She reached back into the bag and took out one more item, a small silver key attached to a keychain shaped like a red heart. The sight of it made my stomach twist. David hated keychains. He said they were childish and unnecessary, and he certainly would never carry a red heart. I drove home with the plastic bag resting on my lap, like something alive. The house felt different when I opened the door, as if it had already begun forgetting him. The silence inside the kitchen was heavy and hollow. I sat down at the table and slowly emptied the contents of the bag. I opened his wallet first. His driver's license, a few receipts, $50 in cash, and a photograph of me taken 30 years earlier when my hair was still dark and my smile wide and hopeful. That picture made my throat tighten. Poor David, I thought automatically. Even now he carried my picture. My fingers moved to the new phone. The screen lit up when I touched it. It asked for a passcode. I tried his birthday. Wrong. I tried mine. Wrong. I tried the date of our wedding anniversary. Wrong again. Of course, I told myself. The phone probably belonged to someone else and had somehow ended up in his pocket by mistake. But something deep inside me, something quiet that had been asleep for years, whispered that this wasn't an accident. I looked at the small silver key again. I turned it over in my fingers and noticed tiny engraved letters near the base. LM25. My heart started beating faster. I tried the numbers 2525 on the phone. The screen unlocked instantly. For a moment I simply stared at it. The wallpaper wasn't a photo of me. It wasn't a picture of our children or a neutral landscape. It was a photo of David standing on a bright beach, wearing a white linen shirt open at the collar. He looked younger somehow, tanned and relaxed, smiling with a wide, carefree grin I hadn't seen in years. One arm held a glass of champagne, the other wrapped around the waist of a blonde woman in a turquoise dress. She was leaning into him with the kind of devotion people once said they saw in my eyes. Behind them stretched a perfect blue ocean. My hands began to shake so badly the phone nearly slipped from my fingers. Slowly, as if I were moving through water, I opened the photo gallery. There were hundreds of pictures, then thousands. David and the blonde woman in Paris. David and the blonde woman on a cruise ship. David and the blonde woman celebrating Christmas beside a decorated tree. The same Christmas he told me he had to work late because of inventory at the warehouse. I checked the dates. 2018. 2015. 2010. 2005. The earliest photo was more than 20 years old. 20 years. 20 years while I patched his socks and counted coins for groceries. 20 years while I believed every story he told me about struggling business and tight finances. My stomach turned as I opened the messaging app. The contact at the top was saved under the name My Life. I tapped it. Each message felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. Just left the house. The old witch believes I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow. See you in 30 minutes. Start the jacuzzi. Another message read, 1 more year and I'll retire. Then I won't have to pretend anymore. At least she keeps the house clean and irons my shirts for free. The room spun around me. I ran to the sink and vomited until my throat burned. But the worst thing wasn't the messages. It was the voice note sent only 2 days earlier. My finger hovered over the play button. Then I pressed it. David's voice filled the kitchen, the same deep voice I had trusted for nearly half a century. But now it sounded different. Light, amused, almost mocking. "Don't worry about the money, Lisa," he said. "I moved another $3,000 from Margaret's savings account. She has no idea. She still thinks we've been struggling since the 90s. Poor thing is too naive to question anything." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table. The kitchen fell silent again. But this silence felt different. It felt like the moment before an earthquake splits the ground open. For a long time I stood in the kitchen staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 72. Her gray hair was uneven where I had been dyeing it at home to save money. Her blouse was cheap, the fabric thinning at the elbows. Her eyes were hollow from years of quiet obedience. But beneath that exhaustion I saw something I hadn't seen in decades. Anger. Not the tired irritation that comes from small disappointments, but a deep, burning anger that felt ancient and volcanic. David hadn't just lied to me. He had stolen my life. He had taken my youth, my loyalty, my labor, and my trust, and spent them like loose change while living a completely different life with another woman. He had made me live like we were barely surviving while he drank champagne and bought jewelry. And worst of all, he had called me naive. That word echoed in my head again and again. Naive. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and picked the phone up from the table. My hands were steady now. The grief that had filled the house an hour earlier was gone, replaced by something colder and sharper. I spent the next hours exploring the world hidden inside that phone. The banking app opened without even asking for a password, because David had saved the login information in the notes section, as if he believed no one else would ever touch the device. I saw monthly transfers going to an account under the name Lisa Morgan, rent payments for a penthouse apartment, charges from jewelry stores and expensive restaurants in downtown Charleston, weekend trips booked to Miami, New York, and once even to the Maldives. Meanwhile, our joint account, the one where my small retirement check was deposited every month, barely held enough to cover utilities and groceries. David had been quietly draining everything else into hidden accounts and using it to fund his second life. I searched the phone for addresses and found one attached to several online deliveries. 214 East Bay Street. I recognized the neighborhood immediately, one of the most expensive parts of the city. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I took my coat, grabbed the silver key with the red heart, and called a taxi. The drive across Charleston took 15 minutes. The building was modern and elegant, glass balconies overlooking the harbor. My heart beat slowly and steadily as I stepped out of the taxi and approached the entrance. The silver key slid smoothly into the lock of the lobby door. The elevator carried me to the top floor. When I opened the apartment door, the first thing I noticed was the light. Large windows filled the living room with sunlight reflecting off the water. Everything inside looked expensive. White leather furniture, abstract paintings, polished marble floors. On the wall above the sofa hung a framed photograph nearly the size of a television. David and the blonde woman, Lisa, raising champagne glasses and laughing as if the world belonged to them. I walked slowly through the apartment like a visitor in a museum. In the bedroom closet, I found David's clothes. Not the worn suits he wore at home for years, but new Italian jackets, silk shirts, polished leather shoes still smelling faintly of store polish. In the nightstand drawer, I found documents, insurance policies listing Lisa Morgan as beneficiary, bank statements from accounts I had never seen before, and the purchase papers for the apartment registered under a shell company. I sat down on the edge of the bed and ran my fingers across the smooth silk sheets. At that moment, I remembered the night 3 years earlier when I had a terrible toothache and asked David if I could schedule a dentist appointment. He told me it would be better to wait until the following month because money was tight. I remembered how he lectured our children about responsibility and hard work when they asked for help with student loans. Meanwhile, he had been buying a car for the daughter of the woman living in this apartment. My chest tightened, but the anger remained strangely calm. I could have destroyed the apartment right then. I could have smashed the television, cut his expensive suits into pieces, or taken the jewelry and sold it. But that would have been the reaction of a hysterical woman. And David always said I was too emotional, too dramatic. No. I would be colder than he had ever been. I took photographs of every document, every bank statement, every contract. I copied addresses, account numbers, names of lawyers and financial advisors. When I finished, I placed everything back exactly where I found it and walked out, leaving the apartment door slightly open behind me. By the time I returned home, the sun was already setting over Charleston Harbor. The house felt quiet again, but now the silence belonged to me. I sat at the kitchen table and began making phone calls, not to friends or family, but to the funeral home. When the director showed me the catalog of caskets the next morning, he pointed politely toward the polished mahogany models that cost more than my yearly grocery budget. "Your husband was a respected man in the community," he said gently. "Most families choose something appropriate." I looked at the cheapest option on the page, a simple pine box with no polish. "That one," I said calmly. The man blinked in surprise. "Are you sure, Mrs. Carter?" I nodded. My husband always preferred modesty. And so the arrangements were made. 2 days later, we arrived at the church for the funeral, where everyone spoke about the wonderful man David Carter had been. And in the back row, half hidden behind a column, I saw her for the first time. The blonde woman from the photographs, Lisa Morgan. She wore a wide black hat and cried quietly into a silk handkerchief. Maybe she was grieving, or maybe she had already visited the penthouse apartment and discovered the door standing open. Our eyes met across the church, and in that instant she understood something was wrong. Because I lifted my purse slightly and touched the phone hidden inside. Her face turned pale. She knew that I knew, and at that moment I understood exactly what I was going to do. The priest cleared his throat and stepped closer to the microphone. His voice echoed gently through the quiet church. "And now, if the widow would like to say a few words." A murmur moved through the pews like wind through dry leaves. Everyone expected the same thing they had seen 100 times before at funerals. The trembling voice, the tears, the speech about love and memories and devotion. They expected me to walk up there and speak about what a wonderful husband David had been. They expected someone to hold my arm while I cried. Instead, I stood slowly and walked toward the altar. The sound of my heels against the wooden floor echoed through the church, slow, steady, deliberate. I felt every pair of eyes following me. My children sat in the front row. Their faces were pale with grief, completely unaware that the man they were mourning had lived a life none of us knew. The priest stepped aside as I reached the podium. I rested my hands on the smooth wood and looked down at the casket. Inside that cheap pine box lay the man who had stolen nearly half a century of my life. Then I lifted my eyes and looked across the room. I saw David's business partners sitting stiffly in their dark suits. I saw neighbors whispering behind gloved hands, and finally I saw her, Lisa Morgan, still sitting in the last row, half hidden beneath her black hat. Our eyes locked again. Slowly, very slowly, I opened my purse and let my fingers touch the phone inside. Her reaction was immediate. Her shoulders stiffened, and her eyes widened with a flash of panic so quick that anyone else might have missed it. But I didn't miss it. She knew the truth was in my hands. The entire church waited. I leaned toward the microphone. For a moment, my mind filled with all the things I could say. I could expose everything right there. I could tell them David had been a liar and a thief. I could point directly at the back row and announce that his mistress was sitting among the mourners. I could turn his funeral into a spectacle that people in Charleston would talk about for decades. My heart pounded as those possibilities rushed through my head. My body almost moved on its own, ready to release every secret into the room. Then another memory surfaced. David's voice from that recording, mocking and amused. Poor Margaret is too naive to question anything. If I screamed now, if I created a scandal, I would become exactly what he believed I was, a hysterical widow driven by jealousy and grief. The story would shift away from his betrayal and become about my emotional collapse. No, David Carter would not win even after death. Real revenge, I suddenly realized, isn't noise, it's absence. Silence can be more powerful than any accusation because it denies the other person even the dignity of your anger. It says they are not worth the energy of your words. So I remained still. 1 second passed, then 5, then 10. The silence in the church thickened until it felt almost physical. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed quietly in the back. I kept my eyes fixed on Lisa. A small, cold smile formed on my lips. Slowly, I turned my head toward the casket again and allowed my face to show the faintest hint of disgust, as if I had caught the scent of something rotten. Then I stepped away from the microphone without saying a single word. I turned around and walked down the aisle. My heels struck the wooden floor in the same calm rhythm as before. Clack, clack, clack. I passed my seat without stopping. I passed my children who looked at me in confusion. I kept walking toward the open church doors. Behind me, the whispers began rising like startled birds. But I didn't turn back. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight of Charleston and breathed deeply. The warm air felt different on my skin, almost like the first breath after emerging from underwater. For 45 years, I had lived inside a life built on lies. And in that moment, I left it behind. When I arrived home, I removed the black dress and hung it neatly in the closet. Then I opened David's wardrobe and began taking his clothes out one piece at a time. The worn suits he wore in front of me, the shirts I had ironed thousands of times, the shoes I had polished on Sunday evenings. I carried everything into the backyard and stacked it in a pile near the old oak tree. When the heap was finished, I went to the garage, brought back the gasoline we used for the lawnmower, and poured it over the clothes. The smell filled the evening air. For a moment I stood there with a match in my hand, listening to the quiet neighborhood around me. Then I struck the match and dropped it onto the pile. Flames erupted quickly, curling around the fabric and rising into the darkening sky. The smoke carried the last trace of David Carter out of my life. As the fire burned, I took the phone from my purse and typed a message to Lisa Morgan. I know who you are. I know where you live. I know where the money came from. Tomorrow my lawyer will contact you about returning every dollar David stole from my accounts. If you refuse, the photographs and messages will be sent to your husband, your children, and your employer. You have 24 hours. I pressed send and then tossed the phone into the flames. The plastic melted instantly, the screen cracking with a small, sharp pop. I sat down in a chair in the yard and watched the fire burn until the last shirt collapsed into ash. About an hour later, my children arrived at the house in a rush of worried voices. Someone from the church had called them after seeing me leave the funeral so abruptly, and the column of smoke rising from the backyard had only added to their panic. "Mom, what are you doing?" my daughter asked as she ran through the gate. "Why did you leave the service? Are you okay?" My son stared at the burning pile of clothes and then back at me. "Why are you burning Dad's things?" he demanded. "Did something happen?" For a moment, I simply watched the flames flicker in the reflection of their anxious faces. All my life, I had protected them from their father's temper, his rigid rules, his cold authority. I had always tried to smooth things over to keep the peace. But now they were adults, and the truth belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. Still, not today. Today the fire was enough. "Your father won't need those clothes where he is," I said quietly, and I left the funeral because I had nothing good to say. They stared at me in silence, unsure how to respond. My son started to speak again, but I raised my hand gently. "Not tonight," I said. "Tonight we let the past burn." The authority in my voice surprised even me. They fell silent immediately. For the first time in years, I wasn't asking permission to exist inside my own life. "Go inside," I added. "Put the kettle on. I'd like a cup of tea, the expensive one we've been saving." They exchanged confused glances but obeyed. The next morning, I called a lawyer whose name I had found in David's documents. Within 24 hours, Lisa Morgan responded exactly the way I expected. Fear moves people faster than guilt ever will. She transferred a large portion of the money back immediately and agreed to sell the penthouse apartment quietly. In return, I agreed not to make the story public. Charleston society loves gossip, but I was not interested in feeding it. I simply wanted my life back. 6 months passed. The house on Maple Street changed slowly but completely. I sold the heavy furniture David had insisted on keeping for decades and replaced it with lighter pieces that made the rooms feel larger. I painted the walls soft, warm colors instead of the dull beige he preferred. I bought myself a new car even though I rarely drove anywhere. Just seeing it in the garage made me smile. Then, for the first time in my life, I traveled alone. I flew to Paris and stood in front of the Eiffel Tower wearing a beautiful coat I had purchased without asking anyone's permission. A stranger took a photograph of me there. In the picture, I am smiling, not politely, not out of habit, but with genuine happiness. Some nights the house still feels very quiet. Sometimes out of habit I catch myself reaching for an iron, expecting one of David's shirts to be waiting on the board. But then I remember the voice message. I remember the word naive, and the memory passes like a shadow leaving the room. I have discovered that solitude is not punishment. It is freedom. Freedom to spend my money the way I choose. Freedom to wake up without fear of criticism. Freedom to fill my silence with whatever thoughts I wish. I slept beside an enemy for 45 years. That was my mistake. I was blind. But I woke up in time to live the rest of my life not as someone's widow, but as a woman who finally belongs to herself. When people ask me about David Carter now, I simply smile and say, "May he rest in peace." Because for the first time in decades, I am finally resting while I am still alive. And if anyone listening to this story feels that quiet voice inside telling them something is wrong in their marriage, if someone calls you naive or tells you that you don't understand money or the world, don't wait for a funeral to search for the truth. Look in the pockets. Ask the questions. Because the truth hurts once, but a lie hurts every single day. Your dignity is worth more than any anniversary, any house, or any promise someone once whispered across a candlelit table.